question for you. If you were a prisoner of war, would you refuse to go home even after your country lost the war? Drop your answer in the comments. Something strange happened in America between 1943 and 1946. Something that made no sense to anyone who heard about it. Thousands of prisoners arrived on American soil, prepared for the worst. They had been warned about their fate. They expected cruelty, starvation, perhaps death. But when the war finally ended and the gates opened, when they were told they could leave, many of them refused. They stood at the threshold of freedom and shook their heads. They asked to stay. Some of them wept at the thought of going home. These were not men hardened by years of combat. These were women, German women, civilians who had been labeled enemies of the state, picked up from cities and towns across occupied Europe, transported across an ocean to a land they had been taught to fear and despise. They arrived expecting punishment. What they found instead would break something inside them, not through brutality, but through its opposite. Their minds struggled to understand it. Everything they believed about the world was about to crack apart. The ships that brought them across the Atlantic were crowded and cold. The women huddled together in the cargo holds, speaking in whispers, wondering what awaited them on the other shore. Some were wives of German diplomats caught in South America when war broke out. Others were businesswomen, teachers, nurses who happened to be in the wrong place when governments decided who was friend and who was enemy. A few were true believers in the Reich, fervent in their loyalty. Most were ordinary women swept up by history's great wave, guilty only of their birthplace and their last names. They knew about American propaganda. They had been told the stories. The United States was a nation of mongrels and criminals, a place without culture or soul, where people lived like animals pursuing only money and base pleasures. Their Führer had explained this to them through 1,000 radio speeches. The Americans were weak, decadent, incapable of real sacrifice, and now these same Americans held them captive. What would such people do to German women in their power? The trains carried them inland from the ports. They watched America pass by through small barred windows. The landscape shocked them with its size, its abundance. Fields stretched wider than entire German provinces. Factories stood untouched by bombs, smoke rising from chimneys in perfect vertical lines. Small towns appeared and disappeared, whole and intact. Children playing in streets that had never known the scream of air raid sirens. The women said nothing, but their eyes took it all in. This country had not been touched by war, not really. Not the way Europe had been hollowed out and burned. The camps appeared suddenly, rising from empty land in places like Texas, New Mexico, and North Carolina. The women had imagined something like Dachau or Buchenwald, names they knew but did not speak about, even among themselves. They expected barbed wire and guard towers, mud and disease, the slow grinding down of human dignity. When the trucks stopped and the guards opened the doors, the women stepped out into the southern sun, squinting, waiting for the horror to begin. But the camps looked more like small towns than prisons. Rows of wooden barracks painted white, yes, but also gardens. Trees providing shade, paths swept clean. The barbed wire was there, to be sure, and the watchtowers with their armed men. Yet something felt wrong. No, not wrong, different. The proportions were all strange. There was too much space, too much light. The air smelled of cut grass and distant cooking, not the stench of overcrowded misery they had braced themselves for. A guard directed them to their barracks with words they did not understand, but his tone was neutral, almost bored. He did not shove them, he did not shout, he simply pointed and walked away. The women exchanged glances, their confusion growing. Inside the barracks, they found rows of beds, each with a thin mattress, clean sheets folded at the foot, a pillow. One woman touched the pillow as if it might dissolve. She had not seen such things in years. In Germany, by 1943, everything soft had been repurposed for the war effort. Pillows were luxuries from a different age. The bunks had space between them, enough space to move, to breathe. The windows had screens to keep out insects but no bars. The floors were wood, worn but swept. There was a small stove at the center of the room for winter heating. The women set down their few belongings in silence. Their minds could not reconcile what they were seeing with what they had been taught to expect. This had to be a trick, a temporary kindness before the real punishment began. They waited for the trap to spring shut. Dinner arrived that first evening. The women lined up at a mess hall, their bodies tense, expecting watery soup, moldy bread, the rations of the defeated and despised. The woman at the front of the line received her tray and stopped moving. The women behind her craned their necks to see what was wrong. On the tray sat meat, actual meat, a portion the size of a grown woman's palm. Potatoes, not rotten but whole and steaming. Carrots, bread that looked fresh, soft when pressed. A cup of milk, white and cold. The woman holding the tray began to shake. She was from Hamburg, where her children had been eating sawdust bread for 2 years, where her mother had died the previous winter, probably from hunger though they called it pneumonia. And here, in an enemy prison, she held more food than her family had seen in months. The absurdity of it made her laugh, a sharp barking sound that frightened even her. The guard watched her but said nothing. She carried her tray to a table and stared at it, unable to eat, unable to look away. Others managed to take their first bites. The taste of real butter spread through their mouths. The texture of meat between their teeth felt almost obscene. Some women cried as they ate. Others ate mechanically, afraid the food would be taken away if they hesitated. A few could not eat at all, their stomachs rejecting the richness after so long without. They wrapped the bread in napkins to save for later, an instinct born from years of scarcity they could not shake. That night, lying in their bunks with full bellies, the women whispered to each other in the darkness. It must be a special meal for the first day, they agreed. Tomorrow would bring the reality. Tomorrow they would see the true nature of this captivity. But tomorrow came, and the next meal was the same. And the day after that, 3 meals every day, more food than they had seen in years. The quantities were not lavish, but they were consistent, adequate, sometimes more than adequate. The bread was always fresh. Days became weeks. The routine of the camp revealed itself slowly. Roll call in the morning, but it was brief, almost perfunctory. Work assignments, but the work was maintaining the camp itself. Gardening, cleaning, cooking, nothing brutal. Nothing designed to break them. The guards maintained distance, professional and largely indifferent. There were rules, certainly, boundaries that could not be crossed, but there was no random cruelty. No one was beaten for amusement. No one disappeared in the night. The women began to notice other things. The camp had a library, small but real, books in German even. Goethe and Schiller alongside American novels translated into their language. There was a recreation hall where they could gather in the evenings. Some camps even allowed them to put on plays, to form orchestras with donated instruments. They could write letters home, though these were censored. They could receive packages, though few came as Germany crumbled. The psychological weight of this treatment became heavier than chains. The women had prepared themselves to endure suffering. They knew how to be victims. It would have allowed them to maintain their sense of superiority, their belief in German strength against American weakness. Suffering would have confirmed everything they believed about the world. But this adequacy, this basic human decency from people they had been taught, were incapable of it. This they had no defense against. A woman named Margaret, who had been a teacher in Buenos Aires before the war, found herself working in the camp garden. She knelt in the Texas dirt, pulling weeds from around tomato plants heavy with fruit. The sun beat down on her back. Her hands, once soft and kept neat for the classroom, grew calloused. But the tomatoes were real. They would be sliced and served at dinner. She would eat them. The simple reality of growing food in safety, of seeing the future in green plants reaching toward the sky, undid something in her chest. She thought about her students back in Buenos Aires, children of German expatriates she had taught to be proud of their heritage. She had told them stories of German greatness, of Kultur and order that would reshape the world. She had believed it herself, or thought she did. But here she was, imprisoned by the Americans she had taught those children to despise, and she was being fed. She was safe. The guards did not hurt her. The other prisoners were not starving. What did it mean? What did any of it mean? The women learned that American soldiers were dying in Europe. They heard news of the fighting, filtered and delayed, but news nonetheless. Young American men were bleeding in French fields, drowning on Italian beaches, freezing in German forests, and yet here in these camps, German women, civilians, yes, but still enemy nationals, still aligned with the country killing those soldiers, here they were given meat and milk and medicine. The contradiction sat in their stomachs like stones. Some women clung harder to their beliefs because of this. They had to. To accept the kindness of the Americans would mean accepting that everything they had been taught was a lie. It would mean their sacrifices had been for nothing, their sons and husbands dying for a cause built on falsehoods. So they explained it away. The Americans were stupid, they said, too sentimental to understand real war. This softness would be their downfall. Germany would still win, and then these same foolish guards would face justice. The women who spoke this way spoke loudly, as if volume could make it true. But there were others who grew quiet, who stopped singing the old songs, who began to watch their American captors with new eyes, looking for cracks in the facade, for the moment when the mask would slip and the real cruelty would show through. The moment never came. The guards were not monsters. They were farm boys from Iowa and shopkeepers' sons from Ohio. They were bored, mostly. They counted days until they could go home. They showed the prisoners pictures of their girlfriends, not to taunt, but because they were homesick and needed someone to talk to. One guard, a boy who could not have been more than 20, tried to teach some of the women English phrases during his shifts. He spoke slowly, smiling, pointing at objects and saying their names: tree, sky, bread, water. Some women turned away, refusing to participate, but others repeated the words tentatively, their accents thick. The boy nodded encouragement. Good. That's real good. His sincerity was unbearable. Winter came to the camps in the north, summer to those in the south. Seasons passed. News from Europe grew worse for Germany. Cities falling, armies retreating. The women heard whispers of what was being found in the camps back home, their camps, the ones on the Eastern Front. Rumors so terrible they could not possibly be true. American propaganda, surely, lies to justify their war. But the whispers persisted, grew more detailed, harder to dismiss. The women who still believed began to believe less. The women who had begun to doubt found their doubts growing into chasms. They looked at the food on their plates, at the beds they slept in, at the guards who did not hurt them, and they thought about the rumors. They thought about what their own country might have done to enemy women in its power. The comparison was too awful to contemplate directly, so they pushed it away and ate their dinner and tried not to think at all. In the recreation halls, the women put on plays. They sewed costumes from donated fabric. They rehearsed scenes from the old masters, losing themselves in familiar words. For a few hours, they could pretend they were back in a better Germany, the one from books and memories, the one that might never have existed outside their imaginations. The guards sometimes watched from the back, understanding nothing of the German dialogue but clapping politely at the end. The war in Europe ended. The news arrived in the camps like a wave, drowning everything. Germany had surrendered. The Reich was finished. The women heard and did not know how to respond. Some wept. Some sat in stunned silence. Some felt relief so powerful it frightened them. They had survived. Against all expectation, in an enemy camp in America, they had survived. Now they waited to learn their fates. Would they be sent home, put on trial, kept indefinitely? The uncertainty gnawed at them, but the routine of the camp continued unchanged. Breakfast, work, lunch, recreation, dinner, sleep. The same guards, the same food, the same strange adequate captivity that had become their entire world. Then the first transports were announced. Women would be repatriated to Germany. They should prepare to leave. Lists were posted, names called, and something unexpected happened. Some women refused to go. They stood in the commandant's office and said no, they would not return to Germany. They wanted to stay in America. The officials did not understand. These women were free to leave, free to go home. Why would they refuse? But the women had their reasons. Germany was destroyed, they said, rubble and ruin. Their homes were gone, their families scattered or dead. What waited for them there but starvation and occupation? Here they had food. Here they had safety. Here they had learned something about their captors that made the thought of returning unbearable. Some women could not speak their real reasons aloud. They had learned what had been done in Germany's name. The rumors had been confirmed, grown into documented horrors that could no longer be dismissed as propaganda. The camps that were nothing like this camp, the systematic murder of millions. The depth of the evil was too vast to comprehend. And these women had supported it, or at least not opposed it. They had cheered at rallies. They had taught their children to salute. How could they go back to that place and live with what they now knew? Here in America, they were just enemy prisoners. Generic, forgiven in advance by a country that did not hold individual women responsible for their government's crimes. But in Germany, they would have to look at the ruins and know their complicity. They would have to meet the eyes of survivors and carry the weight of collective guilt. It was easier to stay here, among people who barely knew them, who would let them fade into anonymous obscurity. The American officials struggled with what to do. The war was over. Keeping prisoners indefinitely seemed wrong, but forcing them to leave also seemed wrong. Some women were allowed to stay, sponsored by churches or distant relatives who had immigrated before the war. Others were gently but firmly sent back. They boarded ships with blank faces, looking back at the American shore as it disappeared, wondering if they were sailing toward home or toward judgment. The women who remained tried to build new lives. They learned English properly, more than just simple words. They found work as housekeepers, seamstresses, tutors. They moved into boarding houses and small apartments. They became invisible, deliberately unremarkable. When people asked where they were from, they said they were Swiss or Austrian, anything but German. They sent money back to relatives when they could, but they did not return, not for years. Some never returned at all. The camps themselves were dismantled, the barracks torn down or repurposed, the land returned to its previous uses or sold off. Within a few years, almost no trace remained of the places where thousands of German women had spent the war eating American beef and sleeping on clean sheets and slowly having their certainties demolished by simple human decency. The strange episode faded from memory, too complicated for easy narratives about the war. But the women remembered. Those who stayed and those who left both carried the memory of those camps for the rest of their lives. It was not the food they remembered most clearly, though that was part of it. It was not the safety, though that too stayed with them. It was the quiet, persistent way their captors had treated them as human beings even when they did not have to, even when the women themselves might not have done the same if the positions were reversed. That was the unbearable gift. That was what they could not forget. Margaret, the former teacher, ended up in Minnesota. She worked in a library, shelving books, helping patrons find what they needed. She married eventually, a quiet man who asked few questions about her past. She never taught again. She could not face standing before children and claiming to know truths worth passing on. The camp had taught her how little she understood about the world, about power, about the capacity for both good and evil that lived in all nations, all people, including herself. She thought often about those tomatoes in the Texas garden, the simple act of growing food in the midst of war, the guard who had smiled and said good when she learned English words, the other prisoners, some of whom remained friends, others who had drifted away carrying their shame privately. She thought about the last meal she had eaten in the camp before her release: pot roast and mashed potatoes, apple pie for dessert. The same food the guards ate, the same food being served in diners and homes across America. Nothing special, nothing designed to impress, just food, just adequacy. just the baseline of how a wealthy nation treated even its enemies. That ordinariness had been the most revolutionary thing. The women had been prepared for either brutality or luxury. They had imagined torture chambers or propaganda showcases. What they got instead was boring bureaucratic adequacy. Sufficient food, sufficient shelter, sufficient medical care, the minimum requirements for human dignity provided without fanfare or expectation of gratitude. It was a more damning indictment of their own nation than any punishment could have been. The women who refused to leave understood this, even if they could not always articulate it. They were not staying because America was perfect. They could see its flaws even from inside the camps. The guards made casual racist comments. The country was segregated in ways that shocked some of the women. There were injustices and hypocrisies everywhere if you looked. But there was also this. When the government had absolute power over enemy prisoners, when no one would have questioned harsh treatment, when the prisoners themselves expected cruelty, the Americans had chosen to provide adequacy instead. That choice revealed something about the system that even the system's own citizens might not fully appreciate. Years later, some of the women gave interviews. They spoke carefully, aware of how their stories might sound. They did not want to seem ungrateful for Germany or disloyal to their families who had suffered, but they told the truth about the camps. They described the food, the treatment, the strange psychological burden of being treated humanely by people they had been taught to hate. Interviewers sometimes did not believe them. It sounded too convenient, too neat. Enemy prisoners praising their captors? It must be exaggeration or Stockholm Syndrome or propaganda. But the records confirmed it. The Red Cross reports, the military documents, the photographs of women in camp gardens, in recreation halls, standing in groups with neutral expressions, adequately fed and clothed. The evidence existed. American POW camps for civilian internees, especially those for women, had maintained standards far above what international law required and far above what prisoners expected, not because the guards were saints, not because America was paradise, but because the system, for all its flaws, had built in certain baseline protections that even war did not fully erode. This fact made some people uncomfortable. It complicated the narrative. War was supposed to be clear. Enemies were supposed to be enemies. But here were enemy women who had been captured, interned, and then released, and some of them did not want to leave. What did that say about the nature of the conflict? What did it say about the nations involved? The questions were easier to avoid than to answer. So the stories faded. The women aged and died. Their children, if they had them, grew up American and knew little of their mother's strange journey across an ocean to a prison that felt safer than freedom. The camps were forgotten. Footnotes in thick history books, overshadowed by combat narratives and political dramas. But the central truth remained, persistent and uncomfortable. Those women had been given a choice between staying near their former captors and returning to their homeland, and some chose to stay. They made that choice not once, but repeatedly. Every day they remained in America, every time they decided not to book passage back. It was not that America was so wonderful. It was that Germany had become unbearable in ways that went beyond physical destruction. The ruins could be rebuilt. The knowledge of what had been done could not be unknitted from their souls. The camps had offered them a strange grace period, a time outside of normal life where they were neither free nor tortured, neither citizens nor criminals. They were simply prisoners, with the peculiar clarity that comes from having all agency removed. They could not change their circumstances. They could only observe, and what they observed was a nation that fed them while its sons died fighting their countrymen. A nation that provided them with books and medical care and space to stage plays. A nation that was flawed and sometimes cruel, and yet capable of this baseline decency even toward enemies. That knowledge changed them, not all of them. Some clung to the old beliefs until they died, but many were transformed by the simple experience of being treated adequately by people they had been taught were beneath them. It was not the kindness that did it. Kindness could be dismissed as weakness or stupidity. It was the systematic, bureaucratic adequacy, the way it was policy rather than individual virtue. The way it revealed a structure that, however imperfectly, however inconsistently, had encoded certain values about human worth into its operations. When the women refused to leave, they were acknowledging this. They were voting with their bodies for the system that had imprisoned them over the one they had supported. It was the most damning referendum imaginable, and it happened quietly, without drama, one woman at a time standing in an office and saying, "No, I will not go back. I choose to stay here, with my former enemies, in this foreign land, because I have learned something I cannot unlearn." The luxury of the camps was not material abundance. It was the luxury of having expectations shattered, of discovering that propaganda was lies, of learning that the world was stranger and more complicated than any ideology admitted. The women who refused to leave were not refusing the journey back. They were refusing the return to certainty. They had learned to live with questions. Germany offered only answers, terrible answers they could no longer accept. So they stayed. And in staying, they testified to a truth about power and humanity that was easy to miss but impossible to forget once seen. The war had been about many things: resources and territory and ideology and pride. But for these women, in these camps, it came down to something simpler. How do you treat people when you have power over them? What do your choices in that moment reveal about your values? The Americans had answered with adequate food and clean beds and boredom. The women had expected worse because their own nation would have provided worse. The gap between expectation and reality became the space where their old certainties died. And so they remained, scattered across America, carrying their secret knowledge. They had been on the wrong side of history but treated with decency anyway. They had lost everything but been given adequacy in return. It was not enough to erase the past. Nothing could do that. But it was enough to make the future possible, enough to let them imagine becoming new people in a new land, enough to make refusal of repatriation not an act of cowardice but an act of terrible, honest reckoning with what they had learned about themselves and the world. The story asks us to consider what we might do in similar circumstances. If everything we believed was revealed as a lie, if our enemies treated us better than we expected while our own nation's crimes came to light, would we have the courage to stay in that discomfort? Or would we flee back to familiar narratives, however false? The women who refused to leave chose discomfort. They chose to live as strangers in a strange land rather than return to a home built on atrocities. That choice deserves to be remembered, not as heroism but as the bare minimum of moral honesty. They looked at what they had learned and they could not unknow it, so they stayed. And in staying, they became witnesses to the complicated truth that nations, like people, contain multitudes, capable of both greatness and horror, sometimes in the same breath. And there were thousands more stories like this, waiting to be remembered. So subscribe to make sure you never miss another untold chapter from history.